Hello and welcome to Polylogues. The Simons Institute recently had a workshop on large language models, cognitive science, linguistics, and neuroscience in February 2025. And one of the main speakers was Steven Piantadosi from Berkeley. And Steven, introduce yourself, and then we go into the questions that I had or that came up when you gave your talk.
Great. So, yeah, I'm a professor in psychology and neuroscience, and I work on computational models of language and mathematics. So, trying to figure out how kids take the data that they get and figure out the kinds of structures and knowledge that they need in those domains.
Yeah. So you don't call yourself a linguist, but of course, this is something that used to be covered by linguistics in the past, right? So is maybe you can tell us whether traditional linguistics is it a science that easily is compatible with modern neuroscience and computational science, or is it more part of the humanities?
Well, I think that historically linguistics has been interested in many of the same questions, but historically they haven't been as into experimental methods or computational methods, and so a lot of work in modern cognitive science and neuroscience is either importing or testing ideas that people have proposed in linguistics as part of linguistic theories.
Yeah. And before we come to the computational part, maybe I think many listeners have heard of linguistic theories and that they always seem to be fighting about some principled stuff. Maybe you could tell us what the main camps are in linguistics, and then we come to the question whether you can contribute something to those questions.
Yeah, there's quite a few different linguistic theories, and I think that that is connected to the fact that there haven't been very strong empirical tests of different linguistic theories. But there's some theories, for instance, which think that when you understand the structure of a sentence, you break it down all the way into little component parts. So maybe you have to build a sentence kind of word by word, and there's rules for how those words get combined and how their meanings combine into the larger overall meaning of the sentence. And there's other kinds of theories in linguistics which really put a lot more emphasis on memorization and how people seem to be very good at memorizing chunks of language. And so you see this, for instance, in idioms. Kick the bucket, right? It doesn't have a meaning which is composed of the little pieces all coming together. And so there's a whole continuum of theories based on how much structure about language is memorized and how much is derived from some rules. And then in turn, what those rules are. Are they the same? Are they kind of fundamentally the same across different languages, or are there really fundamental differences? And part of the reason people are interested in those kinds of questions is that it seems to tell you something very deep about human nature. So, as far as we can tell, humans and humans alone have as complicated a system as language is, and that might result from something genetic innately in humans, which kind of specifies the rules of the linguistic system. Or it might result from something much more general. For instance, maybe humans have a greater capacity to discover things in the world and to memorize little pieces of language. And kind of pinpointing what that difference is, I think, is one of the main things that attracts people to this field.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of these theories basically says we humans are unique in the way that we have language, like a full-fledged language, like we do, and no one else in the animal kingdom has that, or somewhere else. And now we have, for the first time in human history, we have artificial systems that, at least on the surface, do this same kind of thing. They speak to us, and we're going to get into the details of that. So, when did you become aware of these language models and transformers? And yeah, did you think this could somehow have an impact on the research you're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, like a lot of people, I started playing with some of the publicly released language models like ChatGPT, and was very, very impressed with how good they were at using language. I mean, it's easy to play with them and find all kinds of places where, they don't understand some detail about the world, or they have difficulty reasoning through some problem. But when you use them, I think one thing that's really striking is how good they are at language, and in particular, how good they are at syntax. So they don't make very many grammatical errors, and they can talk coherently and fluently about topics. And so I think, like a lot of people, I looked at that and thought, wow, these really should have an influence on our theories of language, because our current theories of, say, syntax in linguistic theory don't have any abilities like that. So they're not capable of kind of producing or describing a large swath of English grammatical sentences in at least what seems like the same way that these models are.
Yeah. I mean, everybody knows that these systems learn very differently from a human child, right? So how can they be, yeah, in which way can they even affect our theories of language acquisition, which is of course human centered? And I know that there are people who say they can't teach us anything for exactly that reason, because their software, they're built from uploading tons of data, and yeah. So in which way can the comparison of these two learning systems teach us anything?
Yeah, I mean, they wrote the current language models take, maybe 100 or 1,000 times as much data as an average human learner would take. And so some people look at that and think, okay, they're just non-starters. We shouldn't consider them in any way. How I think about it is that they're likely teaching us something about the core principles that are needed for modeling language. So, if you look at things like what their inner representations look like and how they adjust their representations, right? They have very high dimensional vector-based representations, and they adjust them in order to make accurate predictions about upcoming linguistic material. And in virtue of doing that adjustment, they come to internalize some of the kind of core processes and statistical dependencies, it seems, that are required for language. So my hope, and I think the hope of people who are optimistic about them on the linguistics side, is that those kinds of principles that we've built in as engineering principles will end up being ones that will guide our theories of language, even though the kind of current implementations everybody acknowledges are not quite there yet. I think it's also important to remember, though, that current large language models have mostly been made by AI companies, and the AI companies don't care about modeling human language acquisition, right? They're trying to make some kind of tool which is useful for marketing or customer service or something like that, and that means that the engineering effort hasn't really gone into making these models as small and human-like as possible. So I think the optimists think that, okay, maybe with some architectural tweaks or some slightly different training setups, or maybe using multimodal data. So if you took in video data as well as text data, maybe some of those would really decrease the amount of data that these models seem to need. But I think right now it's not known what the lower bound is.
Yeah. Maybe in a couple of sentences, tell us the main differences. I mean, it's obvious that they learn differently, but maybe the main categories that are different in learning between humans and machines. Oh, these machines.
Yeah, sure. So one big difference is that the machines are, at least the early generation of machines, were text only. So they were only, configuring their internal states and parameters in order to predict upcoming text tokens well. And that, I think, has led to them being dismissed by quite a few people who think that couldn't possibly give you real meanings. And I think that's actually been a mistake. And I think one of the lessons we've gotten from them is that you can extract quite a bit of meaning from only text dependencies. If you think about a human learner, there's some things that have only been described to you in language, and yet you're still able to understand them and think about them and reason about them as concepts. And so I think that's one similarity actually between models, or one lesson that the models have for how for what's important in human learning. But it's also important that humans, like kids, when they're learning language, are in the real world and they're interacting with objects, and so they get this very rich multimodal data where they can touch something and they can see it, maybe they'll taste it, and that comes at the same time as linguistic input. And so a lot of the language learning is probably coming up with associations between the stuff in the world and the language that they're getting. It's of course sort of philosophically a little bit harder or more interesting than that, because if I show you an example of a toy dog and I tell you it's a dog, you know that it's not just that dog. You can learn that dog is a more general category, and that this is a toy example and not the real thing, and that the dog doesn't have to be in a particular orientation in order to be categorized as a dog. And so people have some capacities, probably some learning biases, which make the discovery of early word meanings kind of structure the discovery of early word meanings. So being multimodal, I think, is one difference. Amount of data is another. So 100th or 1,000th the amount of data, which is very likely related to the fact that kids get much richer data about the world. So a large language model has to figure out what a dog is by looking at the sequence DOG and how sort of what statistically is around that sequence in a huge collection of text. But kids will get it pointed out to them and can interact with the thing in the real world. So that's
Yeah, and
presumably part of
from
why it
from
takes.
very few examples, right? I mean, you show a kid a dog. I mean, assuming he or she has never seen one, and you say this is a dog, and maybe you show them another dog, but then they get the concept, right? And they don't even confuse it with cats. And I don't even know if, for some reason, the word dog hasn't been in the training set of a large language model, how you would teach it what a dog is, right? You would have to add additional data and yeah, expand the learning space in some way, right?
Yeah, so there's some research on this. I mean, there's definitely research on the psychology end showing that kids will learn from just a single instance, even of a concept like that. For large language models, if you take a trained model, often they're good at adopting a new vocabulary item if you put it into the prompt. I'm not sure how well they do if you don't do it in the prompt, but want it to be kind of part of the internal vocabulary. I'm not sure how that would work, but that seems to be what happens for
Yeah.
people, is that we get it and we get it as a new symbol we can think about and reason about. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So this data gap is one of the reasons that linguists or traditional linguists give to point out how different the learning is, and that there must be some internal bias or someone called it a programming language to me, to say that something's pre-configured in our brain that makes us want to learn, and that makes it easy for us to learn, that makes it possible to learn things. And something that they often point out is they take we're talking about grammar, for example, and they take a complicated structure, a sentence with a complicated structure that even people have to look at 3 times before they understand the recursive sentences or whatever. And then they say, oh, a large language model will never be able to understand this. And yeah, what do you have to say to them?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of claims about what statistical models can't do in principle. This was a field of research for a number of decades of people trying to make arguments about what learning could and could not get you for linguistics. And there've been some very strong claims, for instance, that you couldn't, in principle, learn a grammar from the kinds of data that kids get. And I think arguing against those claims is one of the kind of chief things that we've discovered from large language models, right, is that there probably isn't an in principle limitation to what statistics can get you. If you do the right kind of statistics, then the right kind of statistics will lead you to posit all kinds of structures out in the world, right? Because those structures are good at explaining the data that you've seen, and they're good at helping you make predictions about the kind of data that you're going to get next. So people on the statistical end think that grammars are like those, right? Grammars are the kinds of things that a good learner would posit as a means of explaining the data and helping make good predictions. Um, I think that's one of the kind of key insights from large language models. That is that these kind of older arguments about impossibility probably don't hold. Where things get to then is the question of amount of data and whether um, the amount of data required for a statistical learning model is more than kids get. And there haven't really been many kind of quantitative analyses of that problem yet. So we don't know what types of grammars can be justified, for instance, with the typical amount of data that a child receives.
Yeah. I mean, and there's always the next generation of language models, right? So if one generation isn't able to, for example, talk metalinguistics and talk about the structure of sentences, the next one might be able to do that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and people have made this point also about reasoning. So there's been a lot of work trying to augment language models with smarter kinds of reasoning and smarter types of representations, maybe representations about the world or representations about coherent arguments and kind of logical structures and pragmatics. And so I think that as we get better at building those into language models, we'll probably be surprised at how much that helps them.
Well, I'm sure there's always going to be people who say, but it's just a simulation, right? It just pretends to reason. It just pretends to speak, and it just pretends to understand language, right? But then in the end, I mean, I don't know if you understand language or if you pretend to do.
I mean, I don't quite know what the word pretends to means in that setting. I mean, is my computer pretending to do arithmetic because it's just shuffling around bits? Like, I think that's probably not a useful description, but I think if somebody wanted to make that claim about language models, they'd have to say, here's kind of how you pinpoint the difference between actually doing something and pretending to. Otherwise, it's kind of a meaningless claim, I think.
Yeah. So one big thing, of course, that we've already mentioned is that language models don't make a difference between the syntax and the meaning of words, right? They just learn statistic correlations between words and chunks of words, and come up with very good results. And traditional linguistics has these often complicated tree diagrams of grammar. And of course, when we learn a foreign language, grammar is something important that we learn. So, uh, do we have to? Should we give up these concepts? Should we give up the difference between semantics and grammar, or do these all old rule-based models still tell us something or are helpful in our daily work or in our work with language models?
Yeah, so I'd say it's not fully understood how much their representations do separate syntax versus semantics. I'd say in the training, right, all they're evaluated on when you set their parameters is how good a job they do at predicting the next sequence of words, right? And so that prediction objective doesn't have anything to say about the distinction between syntax and semantics. But I think it's actually pretty likely that internally they set themselves up in a way where there's some distinction between syntax and semantics. And you could maybe think about that by thinking that there's some cases where you can predict what syntactically is going to come next, even if you can't predict what semantically is going to come next, right? So if I said, yesterday I saw, right, and you know that the thing I saw is going to be something like a noun, right? It's going to be some kind of object or event or something. And so you might be able to make a syntactic prediction, pull out all of those the kind of syntactically appropriate items without knowing very much at all about what they are, like what the meanings are. And so this is just a guess, but I would guess that internally in these models, they make some of these kinds of distinctions that you find in kind of classical linguistics. For instance, they almost certainly have nouns versus verbs, right, as somehow encoded in their weights, because that's a useful distinction for making predictions. They also almost certainly have subjects versus objects, right, because you have to know whether the part of the sentence you're in is currently picking out the subject or currently picking out the object if you're going to make good predictions. So it's this funny kind of thing where I think that just being evaluated on prediction probably separates some of your internal representations into something like syntax and something like semantics, at least in some cases. But at the same time, they're very good at idioms, so they know what "kick the bucket" means, right? And they know that that shouldn't be broken down into its component pieces. And I think solving that kind of mystery of how it is that you can put together elements of language in new ways and at the same time be able to memorize chunks is really important and not really understood in these models yet.
Well, and I can imagine that the same thing happens in language learning in kids, right? If I say, "How are you?" which if you, the sound of it is just three syllables of sound, and people tend to answer great. You know, Germans might give you a literal answer and talk about their sicknesses, but you don't expect that normally. So it's basically like a three syllable utterance, which you expect to answer in a certain way. And as you said, you don't have to do the grammar on how are you, and it's just a thing, right?
Yeah, it's just memorized. Yeah, and that's something that
And a kid
traditional.
might learn that before they can take the sentence apart, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you find kid errors like that sometimes, where kids mischunk things and think that don't realize that some chunk is actually built up out of meaningful units. But this is something that many traditional linguistic theories have really tried to avoid, is try to avoid memorization as much as possible. And I think that's one of the lessons of large language models, is that memorization is really useful for handling actual natural language usage. And so our models and our theories had better be good at it, because it seems like people are pretty good at it too.
Yeah, that's this famous example of Chomsky from I think 1960. I don't have the. You can give me the sentence with the green thoughts.
Colorless,
No,
colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So and the argument was this is a sentence that doesn't make any sense and has never been uttered by a human before, at least before he uttered it. And still, we see it's a grammatical sentence. And if you change the word order, it's just blah blah and doesn't make any sense. Uh, of course, every language model probably knows that sentence from reading the internet. But language model, you can come up with a different example that hasn't been anywhere before, and they if you ask them, is that a correctly formed sentence, they will give you the right answer, will they?
I think they're pretty good at them. Yeah. So that sentence in particular was constructed so that each pair of words would be really low probability or probably never happen. So colorless green ideas sleep furiously. You never say that something colorless is green, and you never say that an idea is green, and you never say that an idea sleeps. And if you're sleeping, you're probably not doing it furiously. So the fact, I mean, so that example is supposed to illustrate that there are things we consider to be grammatical which really have zero probability, or about as close to zero probability as you could get. And I think for that reason it's clever. I think the solution to it is not to say that there's an innate grammar that gives you that, but to say that your learning mechanism knows a little bit more abstract information, right? So if your learning mechanism is able to discover that there are things like adjectives and nouns and verbs, and it's able to discover that the best way of making predictions is to kind of include the fact that these parts of speech matter a little bit, then you can come to the conclusion that that sentence is perfectly fine, right? So you think of colorless as an adjective and green as a noun. Sorry, green as an adjective and ideas as a noun. And you go through and at that slightly more abstract level of description, it's okay. It's not a zero probability event anymore.
Yeah. So, and I mean, examples like this were the reason for you to write an article that was heavily discussed, basically saying, oh, these old theories are basically falsified by large language models, right? And I can assume, I mean, you said you're not a linguist, so you're basically coming into the field a little from the outside. And there are these people who have had their discussions for 50 or more years. And now this computer guy tells them, forget about it. Our language models prove you wrong. And you said you were bullied in a way. I'm probably not literally, but you got a lot of flack for that, did you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say bullied quite. I mean, I'd say that it was there were some people in the field who really liked this paper and some people who really did not. And um, I think it's a strong claim to say that it's refuted these, and that I think you know rubbed some people the wrong way, and other people thought, oh yeah, that's that's exactly right. I think of it as kind of a soft refutation, right? It's not that there's a proof that these other theories are wrong. It's really that there's now a demonstration that working in a completely different framework with a completely different set of assumptions does way better, right? And so I would bet on the kind of new type of statistical LLM kind of approach for really figuring out the structure of a language, as opposed to the kind of older one. That paper was motivated in part by people, maybe most notably Noam Chomsky, right, saying that these models were just utterly worthless for understanding language, that they contribute nothing to our understanding of language. And if what you mean by language is these kind of innate rules of grammar, then I think you could see how that's you could see how that argument might follow, right? That okay, if you're convinced there's innate rules of grammar, then showing that a big statistical model can approximate it doesn't really tell you anything. If you come at it with a little more skepticism or neutrality, I think, then you think, okay, we don't really have a good theory of language. So what should be our starting point or our building blocks for a theory of language? Should it be this thing that people tried to make work for 50 years and hasn't really yielded that much, or should it be this approach which in 5 or 10 years has gone from very basic statistical associations up to the ability to speak coherently and grammatically across a huge range of different topics. So it's really trying to argue that this new approach should be very exciting to language researchers and to linguists. And the way it should be exciting is kind of the way anything new is exciting to a scientist. It should encourage us to rethink all of these old assumptions about what the starting point is and what the objective function is and what kinds of things should be built in versus learned. All of those kinds of assumptions, I think, are totally up in the air now.
Yeah, but if I understood your talk correctly that you gave at the symposium, you're making kind of a peace offer in the end and saying it might not be all useless what these people did, and we might have a use for this symbolic side or whatever you call it towards the statistical as opposed to the statistical side of learning, because they both can play a role in our understanding of language.
Yeah, so I certainly think there are things in human cognition which look symbolic, and math and language are good examples of those. I think that um, the subject of a sentence is a different kind of thing than the verb of a sentence, and that's a kind of hard distinction that any kind of good learning model is going to pick up on and discover. In the same way that 1 and 2 are different things. And so if you have a learning model that's learning arithmetic, it had better come up with 1 and 2 as distinct symbolic representations that act in different ways and influence computations in different ways. Um, and so if that's all that we were taking from the kind of older approach to linguistics, right, that there are likely symbolic descriptions of some of the phenomena that happen, then I think that's great. Um, I think that there's lots of kind of other baggage that come with the older linguistic theories, which I don't think is quite right. But I wouldn't say that everything people have thought about is wrong, right? I'd say that the kind of current challenge is trying to figure out. Well, let me say it this way: that there is a current challenge of trying to figure out what's going on inside of large language models, and I think it's very plausible that they have at least parts of components that look like grammars, right? Like the set of things that can appear as the subject of a sentence is pretty similar to the set of things that can appear as an object of a sentence, right? And that's described in a grammar by a certain kind of rule that allows both of those to have noun phrases in them. And you can think of that as just a description of the system, right? It's just description of the kind of string patterns or the patterns in language that can occur. And so any language model that is doing a good job of predicting will also know that. It'll know that noun phrases are a kind of thing, and they're the kind of thing you see as subjects or as you see as objects in sentences. And I think kind of what's happened is that theory is very hard to make work in all of the details, right? So symbolic accounts do a pretty good kind of coarse approximation to a lot of language. But there's lots of very complicated things in language where they may not do a good job, and you might have to fall back on memorization or kind of continuous gradients or something about semantics. And so incorporating all of that stuff is what large language models seem to be good at. But that doesn't mean there's no grammars in them, right? I think there's very likely to be things kind of tantamount to the grammatical rules you find.
Yeah. Okay, maybe coming towards the end here. So these large language models are going to develop further. They're commercially developed, and they will have a lot of applications. But for your research, there's other ideas that are being tried out. One is like these baby LMs, like small language models that try to do learning with the amount of input that a child might get until their 12th birthday or whatever. But there's also ones that try to imitate human learning in the way that it really starts with just acoustic input and like a continuous sound signal instead of feeding the system with Wikipedia and words and letters and what structured language. Which are the ones that you find promising to really learn more about the actual way humans learn?
I think Baby LM is my favorite project. I would say I'm not involved in it and haven't submitted to it, but it's basically posing an engineering challenge to the community, both to machine learning and to language acquisition, to say, see if you can tweak these architectures, the way that a transformer is set up, or whatever kind of model you want, in order to make it work really well with small amounts of data. And I think that's going to be a strong test, because either it's possible for somebody to find something that works well, in which case we'll have a really nice theory of language acquisition that can talk coherently and grammatically from plausible amounts of data, or it will be impossible, right? And we might learn from impossibility that there are certain kinds of things that need to be built into models. So, for instance, we might learn that you have to build in part of speech categories, or we have to build in some kind of structure in the syntax or some kind of structure in the semantics. And so it'll give a kind of venue to explore those kinds of changes to models. So I'm very excited about that, and kind of where that goes over the next few years.
Okay. Thanks, Steven. That was interesting. And thanks for doing this, and have a good day.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation.